What you are about to witness is not a legend, but the record of one of the greatest military sieges in history, where the silence of a single night swallowed an entire army. Prepare to see the forgotten and terrifying face of divine justice, far beyond the gentle paintings you may know. Stay to watch and understand how the impossible happened beneath the walls of Jerusalem. Wait to see the power that no empire could contain. Don't miss the details of this night of absolute judgment. The wind blowing from the north carried with it the metallic scent of polished bronze and the acrid stench of thousands of exhausted horses, mixed with the fine dust rising under the leather sandals of an army that had never known defeat. From atop the walls of Jerusalem, King Hezekiah watched the horizon being swallowed by a tide of red cloaks and scale armor, feeling cold sweat run down his back as the rhythmic sound of hundreds of war drums made the stone floor vibrate beneath his feet. Those were not just men, they were the Assyrians, living war machines who had turned cruelty into an art form, leaving behind cities in ashes and the silence of the dead wherever they passed. The glare of the harsh desert sun reflected off the tips of spears, creating a blinding flash that seemed to announce the end of all dreams of freedom for the small nation of Judah. Among the soldiers in the towers, fear was not an abstraction, but a physical weight that made breathing difficult. A knot in the throat that prevented even the most courageous from swallowing their own saliva. Every look exchanged atop the walls carried the realization that, in the eyes of the world, they were already ghosts, merely awaiting the moment when the Assyrian blade would cut the thread of their lives. The arrogance of Sennacherib, the king who felt like a god, loomed over the valley like a black cloud, suffocating any spark of hope that still tried to shine in the hearts of the besieged. Hezekiah pressed his hands against the rough stone parapet, feeling the grainy texture under his dirty fingernails while trying to find in his own spirit a strength that his natural eyes could not see. He knew that the empire knocking at his door sought not just surrender, but complete humiliation. The soul of a people who dared to believe in something greater than human power. The silence that followed the invaders' war cries was charged with an electric tension, a mute warning that collapse was only a command away. At that moment, the boundary between survival and extinction was as thin as the edge of a sword, and the king felt the weight of every soul within those walls pressing upon his tired shoulders. The dust raised by the feet of 10,000 Assyrian soldiers was not just a sign of march, but a veil that obscured the sun and brought a strange cold over the walls of Jerusalem, where the sound of metal hitting shield leather created a symphony of psychological terror. From the midst of the crowd of invaders, a figure advanced with the confidence of one who already feels like the master of others' fates, wearing a heavy linen tunic stained by the dust of the road, but with eyes that shone with the malice of a predator who knows his prey has nowhere to run. It was the Rabshakeh, the spokesman of imperial arrogance whose cry sought not only the ears of leaders, but the soul of every citizen watching from the towers, using the local language so that the poison of his words would penetrate without barriers into the hearts of the people. His voice cut the hot air like a blunt blade, questioning whom Hezekiah trusted to dare resist the Lord of all known lands, comparing the God of Israel to idols of wood and stone that had already been reduced to ashes in other cities. The silence that fell over the city's defenders was heavy, a vacuum of response that betrayed the fragility of their certainties in the face of the cruel logic of an empire that had never been contained. The soldiers on the walls felt the handles of their spears slip in their sweaty hands, while the words of the Assyrian messenger described a future of hunger and thirst, where survival would be bought at the price of slavery and oblivion. There was no academic theological discussion there, but a direct attack on the center of that nation's identity, an attempt to prove that heaven was as empty as the food stocks of a besieged city. Every phrase uttered below was a brick removed from the people's confidence, a crack opened so that doubt could blow like a freezing wind into the bones of men who previously felt protected by divine promise. Hezekiah, hearing the report of his officers who returned with torn garments and faces covered in ash, felt the weight of responsibility crush any remnant of royal pride that might still remain in his chest. The fabric of his fine clothes now felt like a useless burden, a mask of authority that could offer no protection against the storm forming beyond the gates. He entered the temple not as a victorious monarch, but as a broken man, whose hands trembled as he spread the letter of insults before the altar, allowing the silence of the holy place to absorb the echo of human threats. At that moment, the psychology of a collapsing leader met the last hope of a believer, and the king realized that the battle would not be decided by numbers or war strategies, but by something the human eye would never be able to measure or predict. The touch of fine linen against Hezekiah's skin suddenly became unbearable, as if every fiber of that royal garment carried the weight of lives about to be reaped by the Assyrian swords shining beyond the walls. With a sudden and desperate movement, the king tore his clothes, the sound of the fabric rending echoing in the sepulchral silence of the palace like a cry of surrender from the soul itself in the face of the magnitude of the imminent disaster. He did not seek gold or jewels to buy peace, but covered himself with sackcloth, a rough and coarse texture that irritated the flesh and served as a physical reminder of his insignificance before the Creator. The ashes he scattered over his head were not just a ritual, but the recognition that, without intervention from the invisible, all the glory of Jerusalem would be reduced to that same lifeless gray dust. While messengers ran through the narrow and dusty streets toward the house of Isaiah, the prophet who spoke words that burned like coals, the king remained prostrate on the cold stone floor of the temple. His eyes, red from exhaustion and the tears that cleaned furrows in the dirt of his face, fixed on the cracks of light penetrating the sanctuary, pleading for an answer that did not come from military logic or human diplomacy. Hezekiah's psychology at that moment was that of a man who had reached the absolute limit of his capabilities, where hope is not a pleasant feeling, but an act of violent resistance against the despair knocking at the door. He knew that every second of heaven's silence was a second less of life for the children crying from hunger in the besieged houses, and this weight crushed his chest more forcefully than any Assyrian armor could. The answer that came from Isaiah did not bring battle plans or alliances with Egypt, but a promise that sounded absurd to the ears of reason. The enemy would not launch a single arrow against the city. Those words hung in the air heavy with incense and fear, defying the vision of an army of 185,000 men surrounding the capital like a metal serpent ready to strike. Hezekiah felt a chill run through his bones as he realized the battle had moved from the visible field into a dimension where the strength of an empire was less than nothing before the breath of God. The contrast between Sennacherib's noisy fury and the prophet's silent promise created an electric tension, a prelude to something history would never forget, and that the human mind would have difficulty processing without trembling. The night over the Assyrian camp was not ordinary. The air seemed to have suddenly become dense, charged with static electricity that made the hairs on the sentinels' arms stand up under their heavy wool tunics. Where once the cheerful clinking of wine cups and shouts of mockery against the God of Judah were heard, an oppressive quietude now reigned, a sonic vacuum that swallowed even the crackling of fires struggling to stay lit against a wind that did not blow, but seemed to suck the heat from the earth. Veteran soldiers whose scars narrated decades of brutal conquests felt a visceral discomfort they could not name, a cold in their bones that no campfire could dissipate. They looked toward the walls of Jerusalem, hoping to see fear in the eyes of the besieged, but what they found was the reflection of their own doubts mirrored in a darkness that seemed to have gained weight and physical form around their tents. Inside Sennacherib's royal tent, the luxury of oriental carpets and the glow of looted gold suddenly seemed dull, as if a layer of invisible dust had settled over everything in seconds. The emperor, who hours before dictated terms of surrender with the hot breath of one who felt like a god on earth, now tossed on his bed, disturbed by a premonition that made his throat dry and his heart hammer against his ribs, like a prisoner trying to escape. There was no sound of marching armies, no roar of lions or crash of thunder. There was only the presence of an absolute void expanding through the valley, a silent authority that asked no permission to enter the general's tents or the shelters of common soldiers. It was the psychology of the predator who, for the first time in history, realized there was something much older and more terrible watching him from the shadows of the desert. On the walls of Jerusalem, the few sentries who remained awake witnessed a change in the atmosphere that defied the logic of war. The sea of lights from the Assyrian campfires, which previously looked like a constellation fallen to earth to devour the city, began to flicker and go out systematically, not by human hands, but as if an invisible hand were choking every flame, one by one. The smell of roasted meat and human sweat was replaced by an odor of ozone and upturned earth, a fragrance of judgment descending from the sky like a heavy and lethal dew. The silent tension reached its peak when the last echo of a human voice in the enemy camp fell silent, giving way to a type of silence that only exists where life has been removed without warning, leaving only the vacuum of 185,000 breaths that stopped all at once. What descended upon the valley of Kerith that night was not a visible firestorm or the rumble of celestial chariots, but an emanation of authority so pure and absolute that human biology itself collapsed before it without resistance. The angel of the Lord did not carry an iron blade that required effort to cut flesh, but a presence that disorganized breath and silenced the pulse of 185,000 men at the exact moment sleep became deepest. There were no cries of agony, nor the sound of metal against metal. There was only a wave of lethal quiet that swept through the tents, where elite soldiers, whose names made nations tremble, became statues of cold flesh even before their brains could register the first sign of danger. Christian psychology reveals to us that before extreme holiness, what is impure simply ceases to exist, and the Assyrian army, in its arrogance of steel, was undone like smoke by a touch that was, at once, sacred and terrible. In the back rows, where the war horses were tied, the animals felt the approach of the invisible force long before human senses could capture any change, recoiling against the ropes with bulging eyes and short breaths. Where the warrior of God passed, the temperature seemed to drop to the point of freezing the sweat on the generals' foreheads, leaving a trail of severe dignity and justice that accepted no bribe or negotiation. The face of this messenger, which modern art tries to soften with childlike features, was actually an expression of untamable power, a force of nature acting with the precision of a surgeon and the implacability of a hurricane. Every man who fell that night was not a victim of disease or poison, but of the impossibility of a mortal being to carry the weight of the direct presence of divine glory in a state of rebellion. If this sacred silence is finding a place in you and revealing that the heaviest battles of your life are not won by your effort, but by the intervention of the one who fights for you in the invisible, leave your sign of support on this journey. If you feel your soul is being rescued from the siege of fear today, join us so this message reaches other tired hearts. Comment below the phrase, "My healing has begun," and seal with us this commitment of trust in the God who watches over your sleep. The first light of morning did not bring the usual sound of bronze trumpets or the bustle of servants preparing breakfast for the generals, but a pale and sickly glow that revealed a landscape of absolute rigidity under the Galilean sky. Where once an empire's heart beat, there now lay a silence that seemed to have physical weight, a soundlessness so deep that the flapping of a vulture's wings on the horizon sounded like thunder. Sennacherib, opening his eyes in his luxurious tent, felt a cold in his bones that no animal skin could warm. A biological intuition that the world around him had changed irreversibly while he slept. Pulling back the purple curtains with trembling hands, what he saw was not the glory of his warriors ready for attack, but a sea of sweaty faces, frozen in expressions of a terrible peace. Men who had not fallen in combat, but had been simply disconnected from existence. The fine desert dust settled over the open eyes of archers and spearmen, creating a gray film that gave them the appearance of half-finished clay statues, abandoned by a furious sculptor. There was no blood spilled on the earth, no smell of burning flesh that usually follows Assyrian victories, only the odor of upturned earth and the icy breath of a justice that needed no brute force to impose itself. Christian psychology teaches us that true power does not scream, it merely establishes reality. And that morning, the reality was that the world's largest army had become a massive open-air cemetery without a single sword being drawn by Jerusalem's defenders. Sennacherib walked among the rows of the dead, feeling the taste of ashes in his mouth, realizing that his authority, which once seemed infinite, was as fragile as dry straw before the devouring fire of the divine presence. Every step of the surviving king echoed like an insult against the silence of the 185,000 who would never hear his voice again, a walk of defeat that transformed imperial pride into a burden of unbearable shame. The horses, still tied to their stakes, whinnied low with a tremor that shook their muscular bodies, as if they could still feel the trail of the warrior of God who had passed there hours before. The emperor, whose hands had signed death warrants for entire nations, now saw his own fingernails dirty with earth as he tried in vain to find a human culprit for that invisible massacre. He was now the heir to a hunger that conquests could not satiate, a man who had everything, but woke up in the nightmare of knowing that heaven was not silent out of indifference, but because of a judgment that had already been executed with surgical perfection. At the top of Jerusalem's walls, the morning air still carried the freshness of dew, but Judah's sentinels remained paralyzed, eyes fixed on a horizon that defied all war logic they had ever known. Where previously the Assyrian fires painted the night a threatening red, there remained only thin columns of gray smoke rising straight up, like fingers pointing to the sky that had judged them in absolute silence. King Hezekiah climbed the rough stone steps with his heart thumping against his ribs, feeling the cold sweat dry on his ash-stained face, while trying to process the absence of any sound coming from the enemy camp, which once roared like a hungry beast. What he saw was not a strategic retreat or a siege maneuver, but the stillness of a sea of bodies that seemed to have become part of the earth itself, a vision of justice that made the stomach turn and the soul prostrate in reverence before the invisible. The city gates, which had been reinforced with heavy wooden beams and bronze to resist the impact of battering rams, were opened with a creak that echoed through the valley like a sigh of relief from an entire nation. The soldiers who came out first did not carry their swords drawn for combat, but kept them low, walking with uncertain steps over the ground that still held the heat of the army that did not wake, smelling the dust and the icy breath that still hung between the tents. Human psychology at that moment was not one of noisy celebration, but of profound shock, where the relief of survival mixed with the terror of witnessing the ease with which God's hand undoes what man deems indestructible. Every step taken among the fallen was a reminder that Judah's strength lay not in its stone walls or water cisterns, but in a covenant that the Assyrian Empire had dared to despise, and that now collected its price in a currency that no gold could pay. Hezekiah walked among the silk tents and abandoned weapons, feeling the texture of the cold metal of the scale armor that now protected only motionless and pale corpses under the morning sun. He realized that Sennacherib's quest was the same as that of every man who tries to fill an infinite hole with finite conquests, becoming heir to a hunger that consumes life itself before finding satisfaction. The king did not see only dead enemies there, but the mirror of a humanity that forgets its biological fragility and spiritual dependence until collapse knocks at the door irreversibly. The silence enveloping the valley was a living lesson, an emotional healing that began with the recognition that some victories are not won by the arm, but received on one's knees, in a place of total surrender, where fear is finally replaced by a hope that does not depend on visible circumstances. The wind blowing from the valley now carried a silence that hurt Sennacherib's ears, a sound of absence that no royal order could fill, as he walked among the silk tents that now served as shrouds for his best generals. The emperor, whose hands had shaped the fate of nations with the weight of bronze and blood, now felt the cold of an absolute loneliness, a visceral perception that his crown was merely a useless metal circle before the force that had visited his army during the night. He did not look back at the 185,000 who lay motionless like salt statues, for every pale face was a mirror of his own biological fragility, proof that the man who felt like a god was merely smoke before the breath of the Most High. The flight was not organized with the pomp of strategic retreats, but was the instinctive movement of a cornered animal, a remnant of an army now crawling back to Nineveh, carrying the weight of a shame that no future victory could erase. The roads that once trembled under the weight of Assyrian chariots now saw only the dust trail of a handful of survivors, whose eyes carried the reflection of a terror that found no words to be described. Sennacherib felt the sweat dry on his skin, leaving a crust of salt and earth that seemed to mark his fall, while the sun beat down relentlessly on his head, reminding him that he was still alive only by a permission he did not understand. Christian psychology shows us that the worst prison is not made of bars, but of the confrontation with one's own insignificance after a life of unmeasured pride, and the Assyrian king was locked inside this spiritual collapse. He returned to his capital not as the conqueror of the world, but as a broken figure, a man who had tried to plunder heaven and now discovered that heaven has no treasures that can be carried by impure hands. Upon entering the gates of Nineveh, the glow of the polished stones and the size of the temples dedicated to Nisroch suddenly seemed irrelevant, as if the setting of his glory had become an empty and lifeless stage. He sought refuge in the temple of his idol, trying to find in the stone statues the security that the battlefield had stolen from him. But the silence of the Assyrian holy place was different from the silence of Jerusalem. There the vacuum was of death and indifference, while on Mount Zion the silence had been a manifestation of living and active authority. Sennacherib, prostrate before a deity that could neither hear nor save, was the final image of human desolation. A king who owned the whole world on maps but had not an inch of peace within his own soul, awaiting the moment when the judgment, begun under the walls of Judah, would complete its cycle inside his own house. The midday sun over Jerusalem no longer found the threatening gleam of Assyrian armor, but a light that seemed to wash the stones of the city of all the anguish accumulated during the weeks of siege. The air, previously saturated with fear and the smell of imminent death, now carried the sweet scent of incense rising from the temple and the sound of nervous laughter beginning to sprout among the survivors. Men and women, whose faces still bore the marks of hunger and sleepless nights, now descended the slopes toward the abandoned camp, not with the fury of looters, but with the awe of one walking on holy ground. Every silk tent left behind, every sack of grain and every jar of wine was a mute witness that the enemy's collapse had not been a fluke, but a banquet of provision prepared in the midst of desolation. The children, who days before cried for a piece of dry bread, now ran among the war horses that remained grazing calmly, oblivious to the tragedy that had silenced their riders. Gold, silver, and precious stones, which the Assyrian Empire had torn from dozens of conquered nations, were now scattered on the ground as if they were worthless pebbles, reminding everyone that Judah's true wealth was not in those metals, but in the presence that had guarded them. The psychology of a rescued people reveals that, after extreme terror, the value of things changes drastically. The shine of a gold cup is less important than the breath of life of a child who is spared. Hezekiah watched from the wall the movement in the valley, feeling that his nation's emotional healing began with that sharing, where the scarcity of the siege was swallowed by the abundance of the miracle. There was something deeply solemn in the way the spoils were gathered, a respect that prevented the celebration from becoming profane chaos. Every piece of armor removed from a motionless body was a reminder that human pride has an impassable biological limit, and that brute force is nothing against silent justice. The king realized that the true treasure of that morning was not the horses or the weapons, but the renewal of an identity that had almost been erased by fear. The Valley of Kerith, which should have been Jerusalem's tomb, had become the cradle of a new hope, a place where the warrior of God had left not just bodies, but proof that no wall is high enough to prevent the entry of salvation, and no army is large enough to stop the purpose of the one who sustains the universe with the power of his word. Sennacherib's entry into Nineveh was not accompanied by the rumble of war chariots or the clamor of crowds that used to greet the king of the world, but by a silence that seemed to corrode the polished stones of the city gates. The emperor, whose hand still held the cold of the desert of Judah, felt the weight of every gaze that turned away upon seeing him pass, a visceral perception that his divinity had been shattered under the walls of Jerusalem. The palace walls, covered with reliefs narrating his past victories over peoples now forgotten, now seemed to laugh at his silent defeat. Every stone figure serving as a reminder that human power is an illusion that dissolves before the breath of the invisible. He walked through the marble corridors feeling the taste of dust and ash, realizing that although he had physically returned, his soul had remained trapped in that night of judgment, where the breath of 185,000 men was taken without a single drop of blood being shed. Within his private quarters, the luxury of the tapestries and the glow of gold offered no comfort, but acted as silent executioners, revealing the vacuum of an authority that could protect neither others nor itself. The psychology of a fallen leader shows us that the worst defeat is not the loss of territory, but the loss of the myth of invincibility that sustains his throne. Sennacherib looked at his hands, the same hands that had signed the extermination of nations, and saw in them only the wrinkled skin and dirty pores of a common man who fears the darkness. He sought refuge in the temple of his idol Nisroch, trying to find in the stone statues the security that the battlefield had stolen from him, but the silence of the Assyrian holy place was icy and empty. There was not the vibrant presence he had felt on Mount Zion. There was only the echo of his own desperate voice hitting idols that could not hear, nor save, nor offer the forgiveness he did not even know how to ask for. Time in Nineveh became a succession of shadows and whispers, where the king heard the movement of his own children in the corridors, as if they were the harbinger of an inevitable coup. He knew that the failure in Judah had opened a crack in his political armor, and that royal blood once tasted by defeat attracts predators within one's own house. The emotional healing Hezekiah experienced through surrender was the opposite of what Sennacherib lived, a slow descent toward collapse, where fear was the only advisor and pride was the only refuge left. The emperor, who had tried to plunder heaven, now discovered that heaven has no treasures that can be carried by impure hands, and that the weight of a crown won through cruelty is a burden that, sooner or later, breaks the neck of the one who carries it. The temple of Nisroch in Nineveh did not have the golden, welcoming light that emanated from the sanctuary in Jerusalem. It was a place of dense shadows, where the smell of dried blood from past sacrifices mixed with the heavy aroma of burning resins. Sennacherib, the man who once proclaimed himself Lord of the four corners of the earth, now seemed huddled under the purple mantle, whose frayed edges revealed the neglect of a spirit that no longer cared about the appearances of royalty. He knelt before the statue of rough stone, whose carved and lifeless eyes seemed to ignore the tremor of his hands and the sweat breaking from his pores, even in the biting cold of the marble hall. Christian psychology teaches us that when man makes himself or his idols the center of the universe, the first sign of collapse is the deafening silence of a conscience that no longer finds a place to rest. While the king whispered desperate prayers to a god of rock, the sound of rhythmic and metallic footsteps began to echo through the outer corridors, a cadence that did not bring the security of the royal guard, but the coldness of a betrayal that had been gestated in his own blood. His sons, Adramelech and Sharezer, no longer saw in their father the representative of divinity on earth, but the figure of a failure that had cost the empire its invincibility and its honor. They walked through the shadows with blades drawn, the metal reflecting the flickering light of the wall torches, while their faces held the same expression of cruelty that their father had taught them as the only form of survival. At that moment, Sennacherib's lineage became the very instrument of the judgment he had initiated by defying the Creator, revealing that violence sown in foreign fields inevitably blooms within the walls of one's own home. The blow did not come with a war cry, but with a sigh of metal cutting the heavy air of the temple, a dry sound that interrupted the emperor's useless prayer. Feeling the cold of the steel penetrate between his ribs, Sennacherib finally understood that death was not an external entity he could conquer, but a presence he himself had fed with every life reaped on his path of pride. The blood flowing across the marble floor, mixing with the ashes of the incenses, was the final point of a trajectory that tried to plunder the glory of heaven and ended in the dust of an empty sanctuary. The psychology of absolute power shows that without a base of spiritual integrity, the throne is only an adorned scaffold, and the king who refused to bow before the living God ended up prostrate before mute idols, betrayed by those who should have been his posterity and his protection. The blood that stained the marble of Nineveh dried quickly, becoming a dark crust that no one dared to clean, as if the temple floor of Nisroch itself were sealed by a curse that time could not erase. The news of the parricide ran through the streets of the Assyrian capital, not with the sound of trumpets but as a mournful whisper that made merchants close their tents and generals turn their eyes from one another. The psychology of an empire built on fear reveals that when the central terror collapses, the entire structure begins to vibrate at a frequency of self-destruction. Without the figure of the invincible God King, what remained was only a power vacuum filled by petty ambitions. Sennacherib's sons, now fugitives toward the lands of Ararat, left behind a throne that smelled of betrayal and a nation that, for the first time in centuries, felt the cold breath of vulnerability blowing in its halls of polished stone. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the residue of divine glory manifested in the opposite way, not as a weight of death, but as a lightness that transformed the simplest routine into an act of deep gratitude. The people who previously hid behind locked doors now walked the roads leading to the temple, carrying baskets of fruit and offerings that were not required by imperial taxes, but which overflowed from hearts that had been rescued from the abyss. The texture of life in the city had changed. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer no longer forged only arrowheads, but tools for the field, and the smell of bread baking on sunny mornings was a perfume of victory that no Assyrian spice could match. Judah's emotional healing passed through the recognition that peace is not the absence of enemies, but the constant presence of a protection that does not slumber, allowing the children's sleep to be, finally, deep and without nightmares. Hezekiah, observing the movement of the city from his windows, felt that true reconstruction was not made of bricks and mortar, but of an identity restored in the fire of extreme trial. He realized that the warrior of God had not only left 185,000 bodies in the valley, but had planted a seed of reverence that germinated in every corner, in every look exchanged between elders, and in every song sung by the Levites. The king understood that his own fragility, exposed in sackcloth and ashes, had been the necessary invitation for the infinite to invade the finite, proving that a nation's greatest weapon does not reside in its military technology, but in its capacity to bow before what is eternal. The contrast between blood-stained Nineveh and pacified Jerusalem was the final testimony that the fate of empires is decided in the silence of the leader's heart and in the integrity of those who trust. The Assyrian chariots left in the valley, once symbols of a power that crushed cities under their iron wheels, were now nothing but carcasses of wood and bronze that nature was beginning to reclaim. The silence that was previously of terror transformed into a quietude of reflection, where each piece of abandoned armor told the story of an ambition that forgot its own finitude. For the people of Judah, touching that cold metal was not an act of conquest, but an exercise in humility. They felt at their fingertips the difference between the force that imposes itself through fear and the authority that establishes itself through justice. The psychology of healing teaches that the trauma of the siege is only fully overcome when the survivor can look at the oppressor's weapon and no longer see a threat, but only a lifeless object, devoid of the power the mind once conferred upon it. Hezekiah ordered that part of the captured metal be taken to the temple, not as a war trophy to exalt his own strategy, but as a material record of the impossible. The sound of anvils hitting Assyrian bronze to transform it into sacred utensils was the melody of a profound spiritual transformation, where what was forged to destroy life was now consecrated to serve the Creator. This process of melting the fear mirrored what was happening in the heart of every citizen. The rigidity of anxiety that had kept them trapped during the siege was being fused into a new form of trust. They learned that the true warrior of God does not fight to accumulate spoils, but to restore the balance of a world that human pride insists on misaligning. While the craftsmen worked, the king spent hours in silence, watching the smoke from the furnaces rise to the sky, remembering the night when his only armor was sackcloth. He realized that the greatest danger of such an overwhelming victory is not the return of the enemy, but the self-sufficiency that is born in the heart of the one who was spared. The temptation to believe that Jerusalem was invincible because of its merits was a much more subtle siege than Sennacherib's, and Hezekiah fought against this shadow with the same intensity he had fought against the Assyrian army. The residue of divine glory left a permanent mark on skin and soul, a constant reminder that survival is a sacred gift, and that every breath taken in freedom is a debt of gratitude to the one who holds the reins of history. Modern culture, with its pastel-toned paintings and winged figures of childlike features, has tried to domesticate the image of what happened that night, but the reality recorded in the silence of the Valley of Kerith speaks of something much older and more terrible. The warrior of God who crossed the Assyrian camp was not a creature of theological convenience but a manifestation of pure holiness, a force of nature that possesses no pores, nor weaknesses, nor hesitation. Imagine a presence that, at the simple touch of its shadow, deranges the atomic structure of human breath, not out of malicious hatred, but due to the absolute incompatibility between corrupt clay and incorruptible glory. Those 185,000 men were not hit by invisible arrows. They were simply disconnected by an authority that governs the laws of life and death with the same precision with which it sustains the stars in their orbits. Christian psychology invites us to contemplate this warrior face of divinity, not to generate a paralyzing fear, but to restore the reverence that excessive familiarity usually erases. In the Assyrian camp, the celestial messenger did not need a support army or flanking tactics. He was, in himself, the army and the strategy, a unit of power that made the steel of Assyrian swords seem as fragile as glass under the weight of a mountain. Where he passed, time seemed to dilate, and the space between the tents became a corridor of judgment where Sennacherib's pride was weighed and found wanting in a fraction of a second. No negotiation was possible, for holiness does not bargain with rebellion. It simply establishes the limit where evil is forced to stop and dissolve into dust. For Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem, understanding the nature of this protector was like touching a high-voltage electric current. You know it warms and illuminates you, but you never forget that it can consume you if there is no insulation of grace. The king perceived that the same force that had annihilated the enemy empire was the one that sustained him on the throne, creating a sense of responsibility that made his crown weigh more than ever. The healing that emanated from this understanding was the healing of self-pride, the visceral perception that we are guarded by something we cannot control, nor domesticate, nor fully understand. The silence the angel left behind was an invitation for man to recognize his place in the cosmos, as a being of dust who was visited by majesty and who, by an unfathomable mystery, was called beloved in the midst of the chaos of war. The morning following the deliverance did not bring only the relief of survival, but a deep psychological mark that altered the perception of reality for every inhabitant of Jerusalem. Walking among the silent tents of the Assyrian army, the priests and Levites did not find only bodies. They found a vacuum of life that seemed to have been sucked by an invisible drain in the center of the camp. The psychology of healing shows us that the impact of a miracle of this magnitude is as overwhelming as the trauma of the siege itself. People's eyes, previously clouded by the dread of the enemy blade, now carried a glow of awe that words could not translate. The texture of the skin of the dead, cold as marble and without the purple spots typical of a common plague, suggested a biological interruption so clean and absolute that it defied any explanation from ancient or modern medicine. Hezekiah, upon touching the metal of a fallen spear, felt the residue of an energy that did not belong to this world, a trail of holiness that made his own sins seem like impassable mountains. He realized that being spared by the warrior of God brought a responsibility greater than any tribute he could have paid to Sennacherib. From that night on, his life was no longer his, but a sacred loan from the one who holds power over the final breath. The king saw his officers, men hardened by decades of border conflicts, crying like children before the sight of the rows of enemies who, in their arrogance, had become only dust and silence. The emotional healing of an entire nation passed through this moment of sacred terror, where the perception of one's own fragility became the foundation of a new and unshakable courage. In the houses of Jerusalem, the sound of millstones turning again and the smell of baking bread gained a new liturgical dimension, as if every daily gesture were now a prayer of gratitude. The mothers who had hidden their children in the basements now took them out to see the sun, teaching them that the shadow that protected them was vaster than any human empire. The story that would be told from generation to generation would not speak of a brilliant war strategy or an impenetrable wall, but of the night when eternity itself descended to fight for a people who had nothing but ashes and sackcloth. The weight of the invisible had become the anchor of Judah, a mark on the soul that neither time nor future invasions would be able to erase, for they had seen the face of justice that needs no armies to establish its kingdom. Time, in its implacable march, tried to cover the details of that night with desert sand, but the archaeology of the human soul and the clay prisms found in the ruins of Nineveh hold a disturbing silence about the outcome of the siege. In Sennacherib's official records, he boasts of having enclosed Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, but the narrative suddenly stops. without mentioning the fall of Jerusalem or the looting of its treasures. This vacuum in the Assyrian annals is the loudest cry in history. It is the mark of a pride that could not admit defeat before a power that had no face, but possessed dominion over the breadth of its armies. Christian psychology teaches us that truth does not need propaganda to subsist. It remains engraved in the absence of arrows in the walls and in the improbable survival of a small nation against the greatest war machine of its era. The stones of Jerusalem, worn by the wind and sun of millennia, still seem to pulse with the memory of that deliverance, a texture of resistance that does not come from the hardness of the rock, but from the faithfulness of a promise. Every excavation that reveals the extent of Hezekiah's walls tells us the story of a man who prepared what was human, the Siloam tunnel, the food stores, the bronze defenses, but who placed his final trust in what the eye could not measure. The healing that this event offers us today is the understanding that our practical part is the stage, but divine intervention is the main show. The gritty realism of biblical history shows us that faith is not an escape from reality, but a deep immersion into a superior reality, where the iron arm of the empire breaks before the extended hand of the one who sustains the universe. For you, who today feel surrounded by circumstances that look like an invincible army, the record of 2 Kings 19 is more than an ancient account. It is a map of emotional survival. The warrior of God who silenced the 185,000 did not change his nature. He remains the sentry who does not slumber while you rest in your own sackcloth of prayer. The lesson that echoes through the centuries is that the size of your enemy is only the measure of the miracle about to happen, provided you are willing to deliver the letter of your fears on the altar and wait for the dawn. The silence of that night in Jerusalem is proof that when heaven decides to act, the earth falls silent, and what was a cause of dread becomes, forever, a monument of peace and spiritual authority in your trajectory. The end of the siege of Jerusalem left behind a type of silence that military strategy books cannot document. The silence of a mind that was stretched to the limit of sanity and then suddenly returned to peace. For the men and women who watched from atop the towers, the retreat of the last trace of Assyrian dust on the horizon did not bring immediate euphoria, but a state of reverent shock where breathing seemed a luxury too expensive to be wasted on shouts. The psychology of biblical healing reveals to us that trauma does not disappear with the miracle. It is transmuted into a wisdom that weighs in the eyes and calms the pulse. Those people walked through the stone streets feeling the texture of the air differently, as if the sunlight now carried a density of protection they had never noticed before, almost losing everything to the imperial blade. Hezekiah, in his post-crisis journey, dealt with the echo of sackcloth on his skin, a tactile memory of when he was just a man before the abyss, without crowns or armies to protect him. He realized that the greatest danger for the survivor is spiritual amnesia, the human tendency to turn divine intervention into a historical coincidence or a stroke of strategic luck. To combat this shadow, the king encouraged every detail of that night to be chewed by collective meditation, transforming the pain of the siege into a liturgy of dependence. The warrior of God had not only removed the external enemy, he had forced a surgery on the internal pride of the nation, leaving a scar of humility that was, in fact, its greatest defense against future collapses. The daily life of Judah became a laboratory of resilience, where the sound of children playing near the walls was the melodic counterpoint to the metallic noise of the rams that once tried to tear them down. Emotional healing did not come from forgetting fear, but from integrating fear into a narrative of assisted victory, where human weakness is the necessary space for absolute strength to manifest. They learned that being kept by God does not mean being exempt from threats, but being immune to annihilation, a lesson that transformed the peasant and the soldier into theologians of practical existence. The weight of Assyrian metal, now transformed into plows, was the constant reminder that what was made to kill can, by the right hand, be converted into sustenance for those who dare to believe in the invisible. History, when written by men, usually focuses on the rumble of chariots and the glow of swords, but the true archaeology of the spirit focuses on what remains when the dust settles. In Nineveh, what remained was a vacuum of authority and a trail of royal blood in the temple of Nisroch. A civilization that had reached the peak of technical cruelty discovered, in the worst way, that fear is a foundation of sand. The psychology of the Assyrian collapse shows us that when an empire becomes its own god, any intervention from the true divine is felt not as a battle, but as a cancellation of existence itself. Sennacherib did not just lose a war, he lost the narrative of his own divinity, becoming a ghost in his own palace even before the blade of his sons ended his biological agony. In contrast, Jerusalem did not become a military empire after the deliverance, but a sanctuary of psychological resilience. The Song of Zion was not a hymn of racial or martial superiority, but a melody of recognized dependence. The textures of the city changed. The touch of the Levites' hands on the cedarwood harps now carried the vibration of those who had seen death up close and had been spared by a breath. Judah's emotional healing was complete when the people stopped looking at the horizon for invaders and began looking at the altar for presence. The warrior of God had left a fire mark on the soul of the nation, a cellular memory that protection is not a stone wall, but a covenant that breathes and acts in the invisible. This duality between the tragic end of a conqueror and the restored peace of a survivor is the heart of our journey. While Nineveh tried to erase the disaster from its records to maintain the illusion of power, Jerusalem wrote the disaster into its scrolls to maintain the reality of grace. Christian psychology teaches us that definitive healing comes from exposing the wound, not covering it. Hezekiah was healed when he tore his garments, and Judah was saved when it admitted it had no strength. The silence that now enveloped the valley was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of the peace that surpasses all understanding, a sacred rest only possible for those who know that their help does not come from earthly armies, but from the one who made heaven and earth and who, in a single night, decided that the pride of an empire had come to an end. Centuries after the dust of the Assyrian army mixed with the soil of Judah, excavations in the ruins of Nineveh brought to light objects that would make the modern world tremble before biblical precision. The Taylor Prism, a hexagonal clay column covered in minute cuneiform script, narrates Sennacherib's campaigns with the typical arrogance of a demigod. In it, the emperor details the conquest of 46 fortified cities of Judah, describing the siege of Jerusalem with a phrase that resonates as an echo of disguised defeat. As for Hezekiah, the Jew, I shut him up in his royal city like a bird in a cage. The psychology of the official Assyrian record is fascinating for its omission. It lists the talents of gold and silver received, but the text ends abruptly, without the account of the final assault, without the fall of the capital, and without the parade of prisoners that was the standard of all his other victories. This archaeological gap is the negative signature of a miracle. While the Bible describes the intervention of the warrior of God, Assyrian records describe the silence of those who could not explain how the greatest army of the time was stopped by a cornered city. For the modern historian, the geology and archaeology of Jerusalem confirm Hezekiah's preparations. The Siloam Tunnel, excavated in living rock to ensure water during the siege, can still be walked today, its pickaxe marks telling the story of men who sweated and bled waiting for a help that seemed not to come. The emotional healing we propose here is born from this meeting between faith and fact. We are not talking about a comforting fable, but about an event that left scars in stone and silences in imperial archives. The archaeology of the soul teaches us that often God's greatest victories in our lives will not be recorded in the prisms of the world with applause, but will be marked by what the enemy could not do. The fact that you are still standing despite being surrounded like a bird in a cage is your private Taylor Prism. The silence of your accusers and the sudden interruption of the cycle of destruction in your life are geological proofs that the invisible acted in your favor. Hezekiah's legacy was not just the physical survival of a people, but the demonstration that history is not written only by those who have more swords, but by those who have the courage to hand over control of tomorrow into the hands of the one who sustains the centuries. The story that began with the threatening clink of Assyrian armor on the horizon ends not with the sound of war trumpets, but with the whisper of a peace that human words can barely contain. The Valley of Kerith, which for one night was the stage of the greatest invisible judgment of antiquity, became forever the monument that no strategy of fear is a match for the authority of the one who holds the breath of life. The psychology of the resilient soul teaches us that Hezekiah's siege was not just a military event, but a spiritual initiation. The king who entered the temple with sackcloth left it with an identity that no empire could plunder. Jerusalem survived not because its walls were impenetrable, but because its leader's heart became a refuge where despair was exchanged for absolute trust. Today, when we look at the walls of our own existence, we often feel like that bird in Sennacherib's cage, surrounded by diagnoses, debts, or silences that seem like death sentences. But the legacy of 185,000 men fallen without a single arrow being fired is geological proof that your help does not depend on your muscular strength or your political influence. The warrior of God continues to walk the camps of fear during the night, switching off the voices that accuse you and undoing the knots that try to strangle your hope. The emotional healing this documentary proposes is the rest of knowing that while you sleep in your vulnerability, heaven works on your justice. If this journey through the shadows of Judah and the glory of the invisible has brought a new breath to your soul today, if you realize that your siege is also coming to an end by the intervention of the one who fights for you, do not keep this miracle only for yourself. The light that shone in Jerusalem needs to reach other hearts still trembling in the darkness of the siege. If you accept this new time of peace and authority over your life, leave your sign of victory. Like this video, subscribe so that more profound truths like this reach you, and leave in the comments your declaration of possession. My siege has ended. By writing these words, you are not just commenting, but sealing in your mind the reality that the battle is not yours, and that the dawn of Zion has already broken over your house. Thank you for walking with us in this autopsy of faith. May the peace that surpasses all understanding guard your heart, today and forever.